обо мне доложено.
My case was reported to Defense Minister Shoigu and to Putin. I was told that there was an order on me, that I was to be beaten and then finished off. In total, I spent 10 months in the forest. I had prepared for survival. I can start a fire in 25 different ways. At night, through a loudspeaker, they start shouting.
Я понимаю, что
I realize the assault has begun. They are breaking the locks. Special forces are coming for me.
я буквально...
I literally stick my head out and see a rogue bear. It was very angry. It was growling. Then they start beating me with rifle butts on the head and back. They hit my face with boots. Traffic police officers started chasing me. I had to get away from them. I decided to go through the swamps, forests, and fields of Belarus. The journey took me 5 days. When I ran out of water, I collected swamp water. About 80 people took part in capturing me, including nearly the entire district police department and 2 sober units. The FSB directed this whole operation. It was terrifying.
Я казак по рождению.
I am a Cossack by birth. My ancestors were Cossacks. Long before mobilization, I changed my surname. The surname I now carry is German. But before that, I had an ancient Zaporizhian Cossack surname, Holoborodko. Interestingly, in the movie Servant of the People, where Volodymyr Zelensky, then still an actor, played a teacher who became president, as far as I remember, the character's name was Petro Holoborodko. It is a well-known Ukrainian and Cossack surname. My ancestors were Zaporizhian Cossacks. And in fact, it turned out that I was coming of age in Cossack public organizations, in the registered Cossack movement as well, where I had been listed since I was probably 14, and I was essentially one of the founders of the Obninsk City Cossack Society.
Я на протяжении своей жизни...
Throughout my life, for many years I worked in public service in various positions. In fact, it turned out that I managed to work both in the internal affairs bodies and in the penal system. But I encountered corruption in those spheres. Even back then, many years ago, my supervisor from the main directorate suggested that I extort money from suspects and victims in exchange for closing and opening criminal cases and share the proceeds with him. As I understood it, this supervisor, who oversaw 8 districts of Krasnodar Krai, was not acting on his own, but passing a share upward to a deputy, perhaps even to the head of the inquiry department of the main internal affairs directorate of Krasnodar Krai. After that, I told him to get lost. Then my problems began, and I had to resign. The head of the district police department offered to transfer me to an equivalent post. I was a police lieutenant, but the position I held was ranked for a major. I refused because I had had enough of that system. I left the internal affairs bodies, spent a year doing human rights work, and then eventually joined another service. I thought things might be different there. I later became head of a unit at a pre-trial detention center, but in fact it was no better there either, not at all. After a short time, less than a year, I left that place too. That is how I came to believe that I could expect nothing good from the authorities. If orders come down from above saying extortion is required, that payment is needed for closing criminal cases, then what rule of law can there be?
Возникла такая ситуация, что...
And then a situation arose in which, pumped up full of propaganda by the regime, I got the impression from reading the news that whatever else might happen, Russia was probably facing war with NATO. Of course, I now understand that this was deception, that in reality, NATO was not planning to attack Russia. But nevertheless, being a patriot, believing that if it became necessary to defend my country, my ancestral lands, it was probably better to be prepared. In February, the so-called special military operation began, which they were too ashamed to call a war, even though, in fact, it was. 6 months later, we were ordered to be mobilized on the same basis as everyone else, and so, I became a mobilized serviceman. The thing is that since we were Cossacks, we were in contact with the military commissariat. As chief of staff, I was in contact with them, so I went to the enlistment office not because of a summons, but because of a call from the military commissar, just like the other guys. The summons was already there, but I never saw it myself. The fact is, at that time, the common attitude was against evading service. First of all, by not going, you could bring legal trouble on yourself. Second, you would show cowardice. And what kind of Cossack could be a coward, especially since I held the position of Chief of Staff of the District Cossack Society and was on the board of the Taman Cossack Department. My ancestors fought for Russia, shed blood, and to disgrace my ancestors, disgrace myself, and be what I then considered a coward was wrong. Besides, we had all been subjected to propaganda saying that, yes, it is necessary to defend the Russian-speaking population in the Donbas, and that Banderites and Nazis had come to power in Kiev. Of course, understanding came later, but by then it was too late. Now I understand that we were mistaken. There was a war for people's minds. All of us patriotic people were deceived and used. I did not support this government. I always believed Putin's rule and his regime were bad for Russia, leading the country into the abyss. But at that moment, I mistakenly thought that perhaps he was now doing the right thing by defending Russians in Donbas. But again, that was a mistake.
Я с 2014 года изучал...
Since 2014, I had studied tactical medicine. Why was that? My mother developed cancer, and I began improving my skills in tactical medicine, understanding that this was an area where I was weak. The fact is that for many years, literally since I was about 20, I studied the art of survival in extreme situations. After my compulsory military service in the army, I was a moderator of the largest survivalist forum in Russia, and I began studying tactical medicine in theory. As a result, I was noticed, recognized, and it was acknowledged that my knowledge of tactical medicine was considerable. Very few doctors had been mobilized, so the decision was made to assign me as commander of a squad in the medical platoon of a motorized rifle battalion, where I, in fact, served for more than 2 years. We worked on the front line. We were engaged in evacuating the wounded. My position was officially called Commander of a Wounded Evacuation Squad. That is, on the front line, under mortar fire, drones, cluster munitions, artillery shells, and sniper fire. We pulled out the wounded, moved them as far to the rear as possible, and gave them the first urgent medical aid they needed. There are hundreds of wounded soldiers who were part of my count.
Чем занимаетесь здесь?
Спасаем раненых.
Много спасли?
Счет не вел, но, полагаю, надо больше.
At first, we pulled out not only the wounded, but also the dead. And when I saw guys with a hole in the forehead from a sniper shot, or guys torn to pieces after mortar or artillery shelling, it of course created an understanding of what we were doing. What was happening here? It was wrong. When I saw in the morgue once, or maybe a couple of times, I went there and delivered the 200s, the dead. And when I saw, in a large metal container, like a trailer, bodies piled 5 or 6 layers deep, and along the walls were bags containing heads and arms in pieces, you could not imagine that even in the worst horror film. At one point, we had a special mission to retrieve dead Ukrainians, armed forces of Ukraine soldiers who had been killed and remained on our territory. There was an agreement that our side would collect dead Ukrainians, while the Ukrainian side would collect Russians, and then this exchange would be carried out. Under fire both from the enemy and from our neighboring units, who did not understand what was going on, we pulled out the dead Ukrainians. I saw them. I saw what they were wearing. how they were equipped. I saw that in essence you really could not tell whether it was a Russian soldier or a Ukrainian one. They were the same kind of guys. Then I began to understand that yes, we suffered in the sense that we were mobilized, we were forced to fight. But then came the realization that on the Ukrainian side, almost all were mobilized too, except for volunteer battalions, and the mobilization was also partly coercive there, and people were not always ready to go. Sometimes people fled the war, fled the mobilization officers. In other words, people were being forced against their will to defend their country, into which we came as aggressors. In reality, Russia committed a crime for which we have no justification. I do not understand how the Russian people, who defeated fascism in the Great Patriotic War, themselves became fascists. There is a saying that whoever kills the dragon becomes a dragon himself. Unfortunately, that is true. Yes, one could be mistaken, and I myself was mistaken. I was mistaken myself. I thought we were doing a righteous thing when we went to save Russian Donbas, but I understood that we had been deceived, and that realization came quickly, though not everyone reaches it. Some people still, even after 4 years of war, believe that Russia is doing the right thing. I realized I was wrong very quickly, and already by the summer of 2023, I began running YouTube and Telegram channels called A Cossack's Diary, in which I criticized the so-called Supreme Commander-in-Chief, Vladimir Putin, criticized the Ministry of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, and the generals.
Мобилизованная – самая бесправная часть общества. Права даже были у сужденных, которые заключили контракт с Министерством обороны, полгода отвоевали, вернулись домой, если не погибли. У нас же, которые продолжают воевать, таких прав нет.
Я считал, что мобилизация – это неправильно.
I believed that mobilization was wrong. At that time, I understood that I could not say more, and I blamed the country's leadership, the Ministry of Defense, for mobilization being indefinite, without rotations, without leave. All of that was critically wrong, and wrong for many reasons, including the fact that a great many cases of corruption in the army were coming to light. Shameless treatment of fighters by commanders. For example, we received no food supplies, and for many months, we paid for our own food. We equipped ourselves. The body armor they issued us turned out to be, well, of the very lowest quality material one could imagine. The model monolith body armor they gave us, that model monolith body armor, in our case consisted of, essentially, a cover and a steel plate of the 4th protection class. At least that's what it claimed. And I became curious. I went on YouTube and looked up the factory that produces this body armor and how it was actually supposed to look. It turned out that a layer of Kevlar should have been placed over the steel plate. What does Kevlar do in that case? When a bullet strikes the body armor, if it hits the Kevlar, it is broken into fragments, but no ricochet occurs. If there is no Kevlar, then the bullet simply ricochets and can, for example, rebound from the chest into the head or chin. And such cases happened. We were issued armor without the Kevlar covering. That is one point. Then I saw that the helmets with which we were equipped had also been remade from old Sfera helmets in the most shameless way. But that is the second point. We bought a great many things ourselves, from backpacks to other body armor and clothing. The clothing, the uniforms they issued us, had to be washed, and then they wore out. There was no replacement at all. Besides, there was a case when, for example, some food supplies finally began arriving. But how was it? What did it look like? I opened a can of stewed meat and saw that even cats would not eat it. But that is not all. I saw a paper label saying extra stewed meat or premium grade. I do not remember exactly now, but it was supposedly high-quality stew, judging by the label. but when you tore it off, underneath on the metal can itself it said second-grade stew. So I draw the following conclusion. Some general reaches an agreement with the owner, the director of some factory. They arrange things at a certain price from the budget, pay for second-grade stew, quickly make labels saying it is high-quality stew, and supply it to the soldiers. They split the difference and put it in their pockets. All these things were reflected in my Telegram and YouTube channels. On YouTube, in just 3 months, my subscriber count grew to more than 35,000 people. The Telegram channel had about 3,500 subscribers, and it kept growing, reaching new highs, according to the statistics. People understood. People supported me. My fellow soldiers and commanders came up to me and said, "Volodya, you're doing everything right." But no one had the courage to do the same thing and support me publicly. This could not go unnoticed. I understood that sooner or later I would be made to answer for it. And at some point, that is exactly what happened. I was pulled out early from a combat mission, from the front line. We went in for 3 days, and they pulled me out after 2. They told me there was a problem, that I had been targeted because of my videos. And while we were driving back, I managed to remove the SIM card from my phone, remove the memory card, and reset the phone to factory settings, then hide the SIM card and the memory card. They brought me before the battalion commander, and he told me with frightened eyes that the commander of the military district had called him, the commander of the Southern Military District. My case had been reported to Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and conveyed to Vladimir Putin, and the district commander had ordered that I first be beaten, and then, in plain words, finished off.
Мне сказали, что
They told me there was an order on me, that I had to be beaten and then finished off.
с первой частью они успешно справились.
They successfully carried out the first part. Yes, I was beaten by the military police. At that time, the regimental commander, call sign Ashkabad, apparently had personal protection consisting of the head of the military police and his assistant, because according to rumors, there had been 3 attempts on his life by Russian servicemen because of his orders. He surrounded himself with this security detail, and they beat me in the following way. First, they threw me into a pit, then pulled me out of the pit and brought me into the hallway, where 2 military police officers held me while the head of the military police beat me, saying that I was a liberal. They beat me with their fists. Then I fell, and they began kicking me. Threats were made, saying they would now dunk me into the bucket of waste. There was a pit. It was an absolutely dark room, with a bucket for relieving oneself in the corner, covered with a piece of fiberboard. And accordingly, they threatened that they would dunk my head into that bucket. They did not carry out the threat, perhaps because they did not want to dirty themselves, or perhaps because it was enough for them that I was already lying beaten on the floor. The beating ended there. Then, afterward, they brought me out for a talk with the head of ZGT. That is the regiment's State Secrets Protection Service. After that, I spoke with the regimental commander, call sign Ashkabad. I was told that because of my YouTube and Telegram channels, I faced criminal liability under an article for sabotage. But I was offered an alternative. The alternative was offered because I had wiped my phone, and they could not, without my knowledge and access to the password, delete the YouTube and Telegram channels that had caused displeasure in the Kremlin and with Sergei Shoigu, who at that time was the defense minister.
Я уже позже понял, почему это произошло.
I only understood later why this happened. Without me, they could not do it. Even if they eliminated me, those channels would still remain. So they made a deal, especially since I was a medic, a good medic. As far as I know, the battalion commander argued on my behalf, He said a medic was needed. He described me positively. I know that the commander of the regiment's medical company also spoke well of me. And so, I was offered this. I would delete the YouTube and Telegram channels, and in exchange, they would spare my life. I would continue doing my work of saving the wounded. They would forgive me this first time, but if I repeated it, then I should no longer expect forgiveness. Well, the conclusion was obvious. Wanting to save my life, of course, I wrote an explanatory statement addressed to the commander of the Southern Military District, saying that I had criticized Supreme Commander-in-Chief Vladimir Putin and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu because I was psychologically exhausted from the fact that we were not going on leave and there was no rotation. And while I was writing this statement, I had a cut above my eye as a result of the beating. I almost lost the eye, and blood was dripping onto the statement. The statement was stained. I asked for a new sheet of paper, but the command said, "This will do." We photographed it, and will send it to the general, the district commander, which should satisfy him. And so, in this way, I think that this is exactly what kept them from eliminating me, because at that moment, they were still trying simply to take all of it offline, so others would not read it, would not see everything that was happening. They wanted to somehow smother it all.
Загасить.
As my platoon commander told me, I was very lucky that the regimental commander was in a good mood when he forgave me. Because he was in a good mood, he did not fully grasp that in fact I had been calling on the fighters to rebel, because after the Battle of Marinka, which was taken by Russian forces after 10 years, 2 years after the start of the so-called special military operation, fighting moved on to Georgievka, a new settlement. And in Georgievka, the first 5 houses had been taken. The regimental commander was in high spirits, and therefore did not take my situation seriously, despite the fact that such demands regarding me had been made. As far as I know, the regimental commander had high-level connections in the Ministry of Defense, very high-level connections. Perhaps that also somehow influenced matters. The medics' petitions did too. And most importantly, if I had been an ordinary assault trooper, I think they would have eliminated me there without any loss. But the fact is that a medic in war is like a sacred cow, because he saves others. And that means saved fighters, who, after quick treatment, can again go storm positions. Therefore, medics are valuable, even people like me, without formal medical education.
А через какое-то время
And some time later, my eldest son fell seriously ill. He was an adult, but he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, oncology, and he needed treatment and surgery. The fact is that when a tumor exists, the source of that tumor needs to be removed. That is, surgery must be performed. But my son was effectively written off in Russia. They decided to give him only chemoradiation therapy. And I approached the command, gathered all the documents, and asked to be released on leave for personal circumstances, family circumstances, in order to organize not treatment, but the rescue of my son. But the regimental commander at that time, acting regimental commander, call sign Vyatich, the chief of staff, refused me leave because he thought, "So, this is that blogger. No, I won't let him go." As punishment. In other words, I, who had saved the wounded, hundreds of people, could not go save my own son, whom my country had abandoned, whom my country did not want to treat properly, to save him. I made a forged leave pass, arranged with comrades to cover for me, and went AWOL. By taxi, in civilian clothes, through a border checkpoint. At that time, it was not guarded so thoroughly, and I went to Russia. There was a risk that I would be caught, because I even had to show that leave pass. But I was very lucky that they did not check it, because it would immediately have become clear that I was absent without leave with all the consequences that would have meant for me. But I succeeded. I got into Russia, organized treatment, and the rescue of my son. I contacted the P.A. Herzen Moscow Oncology Research Institute in Moscow. We conducted a telemedicine consultation. They sharply reprimanded the leadership of the Krasnodar Oncology Dispensary, which had already held a medical board and decided not to perform surgery. They changed their decision and carried out the operation. In the end, my son was saved, and I returned to the war. I returned to the war because at that moment, I still had not decided to flee, although I was already deeply angered by it. I was furious that my homeland had betrayed me once again. The first time was when I was mobilized indefinitely. I saw 3 times how 3 generations of Storm Z, servicemen taken from places of detention, who had committed murders, dealt drugs, the same people I had once fought when I worked in law enforcement. They received their freedom from the military after 6 months of participation in combat. Of course, their survival rate was around 70%. 30% were killed, but the survival rate of the mobilized became even lower. And all of this deeply disturbed me, this whole situation. I believed we had been betrayed. The second time I was betrayed was when, for my active criticism of the authorities, which was substantive, it was not baseless. For that they nearly eliminated me. I was beaten and held in a pit. And the third time I was betrayed, my homeland betrayed me. Putin's homeland, the Putin regime, let us say. When my son became gravely ill, and only I could help him by being there in person, and they would not let me go. I had to risk my life by going AWOL. I believed I had done enough here in the war to save people who were still being lost anyway, because after brief treatment, they were sent back into assaults and died. I began requesting leave in order to deal with the matter of my discharge.
В отпуск меня все же отпустили.
Eventually, they did grant me leave. My turn came. A couple of months later, I found myself on leave. I gathered documents, submitted requests, wrote petitions, sent them to the military unit, but no reply followed. And later, I understood that for the 4th time, my country, this regime, had betrayed me. And then I learned from my comrades who were in the combat zone, that because we had run out of people, a decision had been made to send the 2 remaining medics working on the front line, me and my subordinate, and our driver, into assault units. This happened literally a day or 2 before I was supposed to return to the regiment. Moreover, I learned something else. I had thought that, of course, sooner or later I would be killed, but the state would pay compensation for my death to my relatives, and my sick son badly needed that money in order to hold on to as many more months or years of life as God had allotted him. But then I learned that, as it turned out, most of the dead were being listed as missing in action. Accordingly, payments were not being made. I understood that the state would most likely not even pay money to my children for my death. And then, what was the point of returning? Besides, I was already very firmly opposed to the war. That is, my hatred of all this kept growing stronger. I made the decision not to return to the military unit. I made the decision to flee.
Дело в том, что я...
The fact is that when I worked in law enforcement, I understood that they would look for me, declare me on the federal wanted list, and the first place they would search would be my home. Accordingly, locking yourself in at home is only a temporary delay. Sooner or later they will smoke you out, come break down the door, pull you out of there like little fish from a can, and send you into an assault unit. I know people who chose that path, and they were still dug out and taken away. And their later fate was, of course, tragic. Therefore, I decided to save myself where I know how to survive. I know how to endure. I did not dare leave the country immediately because at that time I had no information about how to do it. I did not know whom to turn to. I did not know what options existed. I chose a direction for myself, Georgia. But I did not dare to cross the Caucasus mountain range on foot in the winter, because that would have been close to suicide. So I decided to wait for warmer weather and only then make my escape. In this way, I ended up in the forest. Altogether, I spent 10 months in the forest. Since I practiced the art of survival and had studied this art of survival for a quarter of a century, I had stocked up in advance on all the things that might be useful, both for weekend hikes and in the event of a coming apocalypse, a civil war, unrest. Anything could happen. We know that the world is unstable, and I prepared for survival. I can start a fire in 25 ways without using matches or lighters, for example. So I had more than enough equipment. I had several tents, including a small stove. In fact, I could have managed without it all. It just would have been technically harder and taken longer. But it was necessary to save strength for other tasks, because a tent can be replaced by a lean-to, and a stove surrounded by stones can be replaced by a stove built from clay itself. There are always options. But the problem was this. The problem was that sometimes hikers passed near me, even in winter. I, of course, pitched the tent so that it would not be noticeable, but sometimes it could be spotted, and then I changed location. And doing that with a lean-to and a clay stove is much harder. That is, the property had to remain mobile.
Так выглядит мой лагерь вечером. Мотоцикл, палатка, вещи и печка. Здесь картошка с салом. Картошечку с сальцом мы запьем глоточком когора. Я на протяжении
For 9 months, specifically until the attempt to storm the mountains, I changed my place of residence in the forest about 10 times. But at some point, I understood that at the beginning of January, I needed to dig an earth shelter, because in February, even in Kuban, there would be severe frosts.
Декабрь, ближе к Новому году. Скоро Новый год. Но еще будут январские, февральские морозы. И вот тогда я охренею. А с зеленки я мог бы сделать печку. Я начал копать эту землю.
I began digging this earth shelter. I dug it out, but I did not manage to equip it. Then the frosts hit. I had to use another tent, install a stove, and heat it, living in that tent in sub-zero temperatures. The lowest temperature I recorded in February in Kuban was minus 17 degrees Celsius. The tent froze over even inside, but within a meter of the stove it was possible. It was possible to preserve your life, your precious body heat.
Печка худо-бедно работает. И тем не менее, вот она, наледь внизу палатки. Значит, плюс 6 где-то возле печки. Моя система для сбора воды. Собирал снег, топил его. А когда пойдут дожди, она будет работать как и должна.
Throughout the short winter day, I gathered firewood. All night, I kept this small stove burning. By morning, when the stove, which I had deliberately surrounded with stones in order to store heat, gradually released that warmth, I could, fully dressed and under 2 sleeping bags, doze until noon.
Я взял крышечки, проделал отверстие, прожег. Я вот так вот вставляю это все дело. Накручиваю на бутылку. И ждем, когда растопится наш снег. Чернючая. Прямо чернючая. Все, забился моментом фильтр. То есть я пережил самый холодный период.
So that is how I survived the coldest period. I had caches, food reserves hidden in caches. They were, of course, running low. Also, once a week at night, I would go out to the city. I was located about 10 kilometers from the city, from my city. I went into town at night, put a medical mask on my face and a hat on my head, did not raise my eyes to the cameras, knowing that the Safe City facial recognition system was operating there. In time, I was placed on the federal wanted list, and I tracked those developments on the Ministry of Internal Affairs website. Accordingly, I would come deep at night to a store when it was deserted. The 24-hour Piaterochka store, where I stocked up and bought food I needed. I also gathered mushrooms in winter. There are mushrooms that grow even in winter, in Kuban conditions. Of course, there were no fish to catch in our rivers during winter. Fish only began appearing in spring, and I started catching them then. The fish were small, but I used self-setting traps, a special device so that I could mind my own business, while these traps accumulated fish during that period.
Достал ловушку. Ну что, худо-бедно. Она работает. Вон 4 рыбешки. Одна покрупнее.
И все это время я занимался...
And all that time I was preparing for the crossing through the mountains, studying routes, studying, preparing equipment, re-sewing it, deciding what I would take with me and what I would not. I was preparing to leave. I learned how to deal with the cold and with hunger as well. But one day, when I was digging the earth shelter and quietly listening to an audiobook on my phone, I heard a powerful roar. I literally stuck my head out and saw a rogue bear, which apparently, in the middle or end of January, had not gone into hibernation. It was very angry. It was growling. It apparently heard my phone and could have charged at me. The standoff lasted several seconds. Then, with a terrible roar, it turned around and went off, breaking branches. It was terrifying. I have long worn my head shaved, but I had the feeling that my hair had stood on end. I was frightened. It was the scariest moment of that time when I was surviving in the forest, because a rogue bear is the most dangerous beast in the forest.
В начале августа 24 года...
In early August 2024, I got onto my motorcycle. I had my own enduro motorcycle, an all-terrain bike, to which I managed to build a special frame that increased its load capacity. And I could place 3 additional fuel canisters on it in order to stop as rarely as possible at gas stations and risk being noticed there. Because an off-road motorcycle is prohibited on public roads. That is, you cannot legally ride it on an ordinary road, an enduro motorcycle. And so, having gathered my equipment, I set out on the motorcycle and covered 1,200 kilometers, part of the route through fields, country roads, dirt tracks, through forest, while for part of the route, I, of course, had to use federal highways. And naturally, I also had to refuel, because the road was not easy.
Мотоцикл перегружен, несколько раз падал. Было тяжело его поднимать. Вымотался весь.
У меня был бинокль.
I had binoculars. If I was traveling on a public road and saw something suspicious ahead, despite my poor eyesight, I would stop on the shoulder and look ahead through the binoculars. If I saw a traffic police checkpoint there, I would immediately change my route. That is how I made it to Kabardino-Balkaria. In Kabardino-Balkaria, I hid my motorcycle, thinking I would likely never see it again, but on the assumption that if I failed, I would return and look for another route.
Ну вот я подошел к той части своей жизненной вехи, где мне придется расстаться с мотоциклом, а значит и с возможностью вернуться отсюда. Мне нужно двигаться куда-то туда.
Спрятал ее в старом заброшенном коровнике.
I hid it in an old abandoned cowshed, and then I moved on through the mountains. I climbed to an altitude of about 3.5 kilometers. Eagles were flying below me. The route there was not easy. Why did I choose this route? Because nature itself was an impassable obstacle there. I hoped that I would succeed, because in the passable areas, there were so many border guards and so much electronics packed in that crossing there illegally was impossible. And I believed I needed to reach Georgia, because Georgia had no extradition treaty with Russia for wanted persons. And if I succeeded, I would not be held criminally liable for illegal border crossing under Georgian law, but would apply for political asylum. In reality, it was very hard. I took risks many times because I walked over huge rocks, boulders, and across a glacier. I could have fallen into a crevasse. Stones were falling past me. I did not know whether I would wake up because when I pitched my tent, rocks kept falling constantly, and one of them could have struck me. The glacier could have collapsed beneath me. I could have plunged many meters down, from where escape would have been impossible. There was a moment when I almost fell from a cliff. The route went across the glacier, but at times rocks were such an obstacle that I had to climb cliffs without any specialized equipment, because my backpack was already overloaded. I had a long, difficult journey ahead. I needed food, I needed water, I needed other necessities, medicine, a first aid kit, clothing, a backpack, a sleeping bag. All of that added considerable weight. I had a huge, heavy backpack. Plus, for protection from bears, I also carried a carbine with me, on my person. And I had to climb into the mountains with all of this, without any specialized mountaineering equipment, using only my fingers, hands, and feet. And then descend again.
Ну, я как девиз для себя держу такую фразу, что можно ли съесть слона? Можно, если каждый день от него отъедать по кусочку.
At one point, I felt that I could not descend, that something behind me was holding me. I realized it was the backpack strap stuck between two rocks. I had to cut one of them. I almost fell there. That was only one episode, but there were dozens of such episodes. Dozens. I spent several days going through there, and there were dozens of times when I could simply have fallen between two enormous rocks, each the size of a house, from which I would never have gotten out. But I succeeded. And the most interesting thing was that even in summer in such mountains, there were avalanches, some of which I witnessed. Several times a day, those avalanches broke loose from the snowcaps. Snow and ice hung over so heavily that I understood that there, in the place I had chosen, I definitely would not get through. But I reached it unnoticed by the border guards. Probably that is why this route is not guarded. Nature itself does not allow passage there.
Я дошел до той точки, где дальше продвинуться я не могу. И получается, что я заперт в стране, по крайней мере на данном направлении, как в клетке.
Я принимаю решение выбираться назад.
I decided to make my way back. Although I thought that if I had made it this far, then I certainly would not be able to get back, because all it would take was twisting an ankle, breaking a leg, or having an arm or leg pinned by a rock in a crevice, and that would be it. I would remain there. Of course, I had chosen an unsuccessful route, but I did not become discouraged, did not give up. I believed that if it did not work on the first attempt, it would work on the second, in another direction. I found my motorcycle where I had left it. But I was so exhausted morally, physically, and psychologically, I had nearly died so many times there in the mountains, that I lost my sense of caution. Psychology has a very strong effect, and after getting on the motorcycle, I rode to my region, my city, along federal highways. The way there had taken me 1,200 kilometers in about 10 days, including rest days. Well, on the way back, I rode it in a single day, covering 1,000 kilometers. The road turned out to be 200 kilometers shorter. I did it on 4 cans of energy drink. Day and night, in rain, in light hail, past astonished traffic police officers, who at that moment were of course more concerned with collecting tribute for passage on the roads toward the Black Sea. I was lucky that it was still warm. In fact, no one was chasing me. I brazenly rode right past them. They were surprised by my audacity, but in the end, I got out safely.
Так как я 10 месяцев не был...
I had not been home for 10 months, and I found out that police officers, search groups, military police, and other operatives had repeatedly come to my home. They went not only to my home, but also to neighbors, questioning neighbors throughout the entire block. They found the address of my ex-wife. Around her home, too, they went through the entire block and checked everything. They found my distant relatives as well, and went there too. So, in fact, I thought that if I went home for a couple of days and managed to refit my motorcycle, carry out minor repairs, and repack my gear, then at home, where I had not been for 10 months, they certainly would not look for me. The funniest part was that 50 meters from my house, there was a traffic police battalion. That is, no one would think, or so I believed, that I could hide here, even for a short time. Because who would look for me 50 meters from the traffic police department, the road police post? I began getting ready, and at that moment evening was already falling. It was already dark. I noticed a traffic police car that had blocked the highway. I saw it from the window. It seemed suspicious to me, because they do not usually stand like that. Usually they lie in wait. I went closer. It was already dark, and I went out into the yard. I understood that if now the other side of the road, where my house was located, was also blocked, then perhaps it had to do with me, with my situation. I opened the gate door by 10 centimeters. It was locked with a key, and I had high fences. After that, I heard the sound of a rifle bolt being pulled back, and I do not confuse that with anything, because I spent 2 years in a combat zone. I heard, my eyesight is not very good, but my hearing is excellent. I heard a whisper, "Take him." I understood that it was an arrest group, that it was special forces coming for me. Only I did not know whose special forces these were. My thoughts were that it was the Federal Security Service Special Unit, Alpha Anti-Terror. But I did not understand why. I was not that important. Yes, I ran channels. I criticized the authorities. I engaged on those channels specifically in anti-war activity, but I could hardly believe it. Even in my worst nightmare, I could not have imagined that Alpha had come for me. I understood they were waiting for me to come out so they could grab me. Instead, I carefully pretended not to notice, closed the gate, and locked it. I heard rustling at the neighbors' houses to the left and right, and assumed that most likely there were operatives watching me there. That meant I needed to run somewhere. I understood the assault had not started immediately. They were waiting for me to come out. For some reason, they believed I was about to step outside. I made a decision and went toward the vegetable garden. There was thick overgrowth there, and I could not be seen. But I had a motorcycle. I had belongings. Without them, I would not get out. I understood I needed to try to escape with all of it. Of course, that too was a mistake. I went back, seeing that the assault had not begun, and I rolled the motorcycle into the garden. Of course, it made noise. I understood that maybe the operatives could see me from the neighbor's side, but I tried to do it as discreetly as possible, dragging out the bags and the motorcycle. The motorcycle is 250 cubic centimeters. It's heavy, but manageable enough for me to move. Besides, I had done sports all my life. I took out bolt cutters and began cutting the chain link fence toward the neighbor's yard. I cut a meter-wide passage, laid the fence down, rolled the motorcycle through, moved the belongings, then lifted the fence and disguised it with some wire. I rolled the motorcycle through that yard, and they did not attack me. I managed to do it. I crossed the second yard, and then heard noise, the sound of blows on the metal gate. I understood the assault had begun, that they were breaking the locks. The special forces were coming for me. I managed to move into the next yard, and like that, through yards and gardens, cutting fences and closing them behind me, rolling the motorcycle, hiding it, covering it with a tarp, dragging 5 large bags that were supposed to travel with me on the motorcycle. I understood they had most likely surrounded the whole block, but there was still hope that I could get out. All I needed was to roll the motorcycle out from someone else's yard, move it 200 meters away, start it, and I would be gone. They would not have found me. They would not have caught me. Over a loudspeaker at night, they began shouting, "Vova, come out, let's talk." I saw many flashlights shining over the gardens of my yard, my property. When those flashlights pointed in my direction, I dropped to the ground and froze. Then they moved on. In the end, I realized they may have discovered how I got out and in which direction I went. Meanwhile, a vehicle drove around the block, and over the loudspeaker urged me to come out and surrender. I understood that they had sealed off the entire block. I did not know what to do. I thought perhaps I would try to hide in the attic somewhere, but I understood dawn was near. They would start searching everything, the whole block, and they would find me in any event. A few seconds passed, and I noticed that special unit officers were creeping toward me, armed with rifles, wearing helmets and body armor. On their heads they had night vision devices of the binocular type. At last they saw me through the bushes and began shouting obscenities, threatening that they would shoot me. They ordered me to comply, to get on my knees and put my hands behind my head. I got on my knees and put my hands behind my head. They came up to me, face down. I dropped face down. They fastened handcuffs on me with my hands placed behind my back. And after that, while I was already in handcuffs, they began beating me with rifle butts on the head, on the back, and kicking me in the face with their boots. I cried out, saying, "But I'm already defenseless. What are you doing?" They lifted me up. Then I saw that I was surrounded by about 30 different officers. Some were in uniform, but some were not. Some were in civilian clothes. I asked who was arresting me. One of them asked, "What do you mean, who?" Well, who? Federal Security Service? Ministry of Internal Affairs? Russian National Guard? One of them told me, "Everyone you named, everyone is here." After that, they took me to that traffic police battalion 50 meters from my home and marched me past a line of police officers. I would guess there were about 50 of them. As I was later told, around 80 people took part in capturing me. Almost the entire district police department had sealed off the block, and 2 SOBR SWAT team units who came all the way from Krasnodar. They arrived on 2 buses and took part in arresting me. The Federal Security Service directed the whole operation. As one of the security officers later told me when I was already being questioned, if you had sat quietly and peacefully, just staying put, after leaving your unit without permission, no one would have looked very hard for you. There are many people like you who ran away. But you started anti-war activity, criticizing the regime, criticizing Vladimir Putin for the war he unleashed. And reports about you went all the way to Defense Minister Andrei Belousov. And then, like this, he pointed upward with a finger and said, "And to the very top, it was reported about you, to the first person." After that, he said, orders were given to find you at all costs. After the police station, they brought me to the detectives at the district police department and questioned me. They waited for the military police from Krasnodar, and then took me to Krasnodar. They put me in a cage on the 4th floor under surveillance cameras. The cage was in a temporary detention room. And in that cage they kept me for almost 3 weeks, in conditions close to torture. I slept on the floor, my head hurt terribly, I had a concussion. To use the toilet, I sometimes had to wait for hours until they escorted me there. And I was kept under heightened guard the entire time. 4 weeks later, they summoned me and took me into some room. As it turned out, it was the chief's office, where 2 men in civilian clothes were standing. One of them showed me identification as a captain of the Federal Security Service and asked, "Do you know why we are here?" I said, "I can guess, because of my videos and Telegram channel." Yes, they questioned me, and I did not hide anything. I told them everything as it was regarding my attitude toward the war. They asked me why I called Vladimir Putin Bloody Vladimir. I explained that I considered him bloody because through his fault, hundreds of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians were dying in a war that was unnecessary. I understood that they were accusing me of supposedly spreading fake information about the Russian army, because when I spoke of meat grinder assaults, they pretended such things could not happen. I asked them a question and made a suggestion. Ask any of the roughly 200 deserters here who have been in assault units, who have seen all of this. They will confirm exactly the same thing to you. And there is even a hero of Russia here. There are many with orders of courage. I myself have an award, the Medal for Bravery, and they would tell you the same thing I am. But that was of no interest to the officers. They had been given a task, and after taking my statement, they left, saying that my fate would be decided by their superiors. Soon afterward, literally within a few days, they transferred me to the assembly point of the city of Novorossiysk. They immediately brought me to an investigator. The investigator asked, "So, are you going to keep making videos and running from us?" I pretended to be submissive, but I did not tell the investigator that, of course, I would not run, and, of course, I would not make videos. Instead, I asked him a question in return. "And what? Is there any point in that?" He answered for me himself. "No, of course not. There is no point. You will change nothing," and so on. Seeing that I appeared obedient, they sent me to the assembly point in Novorossiysk. And I was very lucky, because there are many places from which escaping is much harder. This place too was guarded, but because of a shortage of military police personnel, we were guarded by paratroopers from a neighboring division located in the same city, Novorossiysk. These paratroopers were mostly contract soldiers, or sometimes some sturdy conscripts, and they guarded us around the perimeter, while we were kept inside a fenced section of the military unit. That is, the military base itself had fences and guards, and inside that base, they made a smaller enclosed area, fenced it off, and set up 2 military tents. There were close to 30 of us there, fewer than in Krasnodar, and once we were in Novorossiysk, I began preparing my escape. I managed to obtain a new phone, a new SIM card, and got in touch with people who could help me. I began borrowing money, because when I was detained, I was also robbed of a significant sum of money. More than 80,000 rubles was stolen from me by law enforcement officers. Whether they were SOBR officers or detectives, I do not know. In Novorossiysk, sometimes workers were needed at the food warehouse to work as loaders. After lying in a cage for a month without being able to move, practically in a cage, I felt that my muscles had weakened. I needed them. All my life I have been involved in sports. I am reached a high level in the universal combat and strength triathlon, and I understood that I needed to recover. I began volunteering for the warehouse so that I could work 12 hours and get myself back into shape, understanding that this would help me on the day of escape. And I searched. I searched for a chance to flee. At 4 a.m., I woke every night to see whether the guards were asleep. The guards were not asleep, but one night, the guards fell asleep. I slipped past them, climbed over one fence, walked on, climbed over another fence, reached wasteland areas, crossed them in civilian clothes, and called a taxi. The taxi came only on the 3rd attempt. I got out of the city of Novorossiysk. I was nervous, but I understood that this was my only chance. After that, having reached the necessary point arranged in advance, I reunited with the things I needed, money and my motorcycle, and moved off toward Belarus.
Ну вот, мой мотоцикл через покупателей вернулся ко мне.
Причем ехал я опять
Again, I was brazenly traveling along the highways. I made a mistake, of course, because in Adygea, they began pursuing me. Traffic police officers. I had to get away from them across the fields. It turned out they had sealed off the area. I do not know for what reason. Perhaps they knew who I was and were actively looking for me. Perhaps it bothered them that I was violating traffic rules, riding a motorcycle there that was not intended for public roads. But they had sealed it off so tightly that even a day later, when I tried to get out, there were still 2 more pursuits after me. I escaped the second pursuit and the third pursuit as well. Moreover, the third time I had to cross a water-filled ditch, jumping on the loaded motorcycle after accelerating to high speed, and the motorcycle could have torn out of my hands. I held onto it and kept moving through the fields. Some time later, after riding another day on that motorcycle, whose frame had cracked when I jumped over the water-filled ditch, I had to throw away many belongings because the motorcycle could no longer function properly due to the cracked frame. That was a major loss, because I had assumed I would reach Belarus on the motorcycle. But it did not work out, and I had to change tactics. I abandoned the motorcycle and began hitchhiking to the border with Belarus. After several days, I arrived. After that, I decided not to go through the border checkpoint, because Russian border guards were stationed there between the allied states of Russia and Belarus. Belarusian border guards are not there. The Russian border guards inspect travelers, and they have databases on Russian military personnel, on Russian servicemen. Even though they had already removed me from the federal wanted list during the 2 months I had spent under guard in our political Gestapo, I understood that I would not talk my way out of things during a border check, because I would have to show either a leave pass or explain why I wanted to get into Belarus. I did it differently. I decided to go through the swamps, forests, and fields of Belarus, because that was the safer option for me. I had with me a supply of food that would last for several days, and the journey took me 5 days, including rests and breaks. When I ran out of water, I collected swamp water. I had no possibility to boil it, and I did not want to risk it near the state border. So I usually drank that water without boiling, simply running it through a filter. I had a filter, but it did not remove the taste, the aftertaste of that disgusting swamp water. At one point, when my shoes and clothes were soaked through because I was walking in water, sometimes knee-deep, at some point, I decided that I needed to dry myself out. I did not want to make a fire, but once I had crossed the border and moved farther away, I lit a fire. I managed to dry my clothes and threw a branch of a coniferous plant into a plastic bottle with water, swamp water. I boiled it, and it was the most delicious tea of my life.
А вот там чай. Чай с веточками хвои. Мой чаек еще не вскипел, но уже теплый. А сало готово. Почти.
I did not know whether I would be able to get through those places, but I discovered a wild boar trail. I thought that if a boar, a large boar, judging by the tracks, had managed to pass, then I would be able to pass as well. But the boar, of course, had gone along the edge of the swamp, whereas afterward I had to cut across it. But I found a place. The boar, in essence, helped me get through. It showed me the way, so to speak.
Кабаний след. Мне удобнее идти здесь.
Выбравшись в Беларусь,
After getting into Belarus, where I had never been before, I of course breathed in that air. It felt freer to me than in Russia. Although I understood that the dictatorship in Belarus was the same, I understood that this was not the end of the route. In the end, after crossing that border, I reached a city, rented an apartment, and washed myself in order to get rid of the smell of smoke, dirt, and all the rest, because it could attract the attention of police officers, and I still needed to buy a ticket and fly out.
Сегодня прямо в ванную приму. Я уже забыл, что это такое, что это за счастье. Ну вот красота. Это не водичка с болота.
Я не знал, как поступить.
I did not know what to do with my military ID. I tried to send it by mail with a receipt, but I was refused. They said that a military ID was in fact an identity document, like a passport. Therefore, we cannot forward your ID. I had no other options for sending it away. I had good scans of it. I considered that sufficient, so shortly before the flight, I tore up the military ID, recorded it on video, and burned it in a trash bin while in Minsk.
Сгорит ко всем чертям. Я почувствовал облегчение.
I felt relief at getting rid of it. That all of it, all those anxious periods of my life would be behind me, provided that everything worked out. I regretted only one thing. Why had I not done this sooner? Why had I not left the country earlier? Why had I not rid myself sooner of everything that tied me to military service? For me, getting through security screening was the most nerve-wracking part. I knew I was doing nothing to draw attention to myself. It seemed I had nothing that would suggest military service. I was in civilian clothes. I had no documents. I had even broken and destroyed my VTB bank card, the military card onto which my salary had been paid. But after being wounded, during my service, I was injured in a kamikaze drone blast. I have more than 40 fragments in my body, some of them up to a centimeter long. The largest is about a centimeter. I looked into the matter and realized I most likely would not get through the metal detector, that it would beep at my hand because of a fragment. Most of the fragments, however, were in the backs of my legs. I understood that anyone who saw them, anyone familiar with such injuries, would realize they were shrapnel wounds. And then I would have to invent something, talk my way out of it. I began working out a cover story to explain everything. And the detector really did beep, but not loudly. In the end, it was not a problem. I got through. The border guard studied my passport for a very long time, very long indeed, checking me through all sorts of databases, a Belarusian border guard. Meanwhile, his colleague had already let 3 people through while he was checking only me. Yet, he did not ask a single question. I think he understood perfectly well who I was and what I was, but absolved himself of responsibility when he saw that I was not yet in the databases. I was doing this when I was no longer on the federal wanted list. They had removed me from it after my capture. I boarded the plane. I had never flown before. Then I saw that the aircraft, which had begun taxiing, came to a stop. Ahead, a vehicle with flashing lights had stopped as well. I thought they had probably been waiting. That Federal Security Service officers had waited for me to board the plane and try to leave the country, so they could reclassify the charge from unauthorized absence from unit to desertion under Article 338, attempted desertion. That is, they would now stop the plane, take me off, and drag me away. But it turned out to be routine procedure. Nothing of the sort happened. The plane took off. I felt like a free man. My whole life, especially in recent years, had been some kind of quest, some kind of Hollywood blockbuster. If someone had told me this story, I would not have believed it unless I had lived through it myself. But I understood that my new life was beginning there, and I swore to myself that it would not end there, because there are many like me back there who do not know how to get out. And for that reason, I began anti-war work, continued anti-war work, and had to create new channels on Telegram and YouTube. I decided to call them the hard sign. Why the hard sign? Because for some reason people believe that desertion is cowardice, that it is weakness. Perhaps in some cases, such as the Great Patriotic War, when Soviet citizens were fighting an aggressor that had attacked our country, that would have been true, and was true. But this is not that war. This is a sacred war for Ukrainians. We are the aggressors, Russians. And leaving such a war is not shameful. Leaving such a war is honorable. And right now, the people who are able to leave the combat zone are people who can be called the hard sign, because by an act of will, they decided for themselves that they would not take part in this war. And it does not matter whether he is mobilized, a contract soldier, or a conscript forced to sign a contract. And sometimes, a contract is signed on his behalf. A person who leaves shows strength of character, and everything will work out for him. I began helping other deserters escape. I founded a project that I called the Hard Sign, and now I no longer work on this project alone. Other deserters work with me, people who, like me, went through this entire route as well. To those who have already taken up arms and are in the combat zone, I have one piece of advice for you. Guys, I was in your place. All you need to do is find the strength within yourselves to leave the combat zone. You do not know how to do it. You think it is impossible? You think it will all end soon? Believe me, for the first 6 months, for the first year, I thought it would all end. Even in 2023, we kept waiting for the president's address, for speeches saying there would be an end to the war. Then, we waited for Donald Trump. Donald Trump has already been president again for more than a year, having promised to end the war in one day. But the war continues. It is useful to Vladimir Putin. It is useful to the people who stand behind Vladimir Putin. And this war will continue as long as he wants. Therefore, if there is a chance to stop, then do it. If the so-called commander-in-chief, the self-proclaimed ruler of all Rus, does not want to do it, then do it yourselves, for your own sake.
The Insider's journalists continue their work despite pressure from Russian authorities. You can support them by liking this video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to our channel. If you'd like to further support their efforts, consider making a donation by clicking the link in the description below.